evening. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and this is a good one. Our guest tonight is Andrew Rudalevige, who is the Thomas Brackett Reed Professor of Government at Bowdoin College. And he's a pretty well-known guy and an expert in fields that I think are important to you and important to all of us. His most recent book is called By Executive Order, Bureaucratic Management and the Limits of Presidential Power. And that couldn't be more topical. We read every day about the President's executive orders and executive memoranda, which seeks to change our country. And this is the man who is recognized across the country as one of the primary experts in this field. I want to, I should add a couple of other things. He's been at Bowdoin for a while, and he's a graduate of the University of Chicago and has his master's and his PhD from Harvard University. I wanted to kind of create a context for Professor Rudalevige's comments here tonight. And I would like to begin, because all of this is topical, we've all been reading about it in the news very recently, beginning with the confrontation between President Trump and the governor of Maine, Governor Mills. And I would observe that that wasn't a confrontation that she sought. She was confronted and she responded very briefly. And she's been asked about that a lot, and a lot of people around the country praise her. A lot of people around the United States criticize her. But as she pointed out yesterday, it was not about whether trans athletes should participate in particular gender activities and sports activities. That was not what her dispute with the president was about. She said yesterday in answer to a question about this, she's read the Constitution, which gives the president the power to execute laws, not to make them, she said. The Constitution doesn't allow him to make the laws out of whole cloth by tweet or Instagram, or by press release or executive order. It's just, she says, fundamental law, and I stand for the rule of law and the separation of powers. That comment alone shouldn't agitate anybody watching this program, because it's true. And you would agree that that's true. And we're going to find out more about executive orders and powers of the president in talking to Professor Rudalevige. If you love Trump, I want to say this, a couple of remarks here, because I know some of the people watching this are, strong supporters of President Trump. If you love Trump, be satisfied. He's going to be president for the next 4 years. But please, just stand up for the Constitution, for the rule of law, and due process. Most, but not all, of the Republicans I know who believe what Trump says. You're my friends. You believe Trump. And to my mind, you're all good people. But you can support Trump generally and at the same time oppose his efforts to erode due process and the rule of law. History reveals that lots of good people believed in the big lies of autocrats. It is not unusual. Usually autocrats are very good at this. Large numbers of Russians believed what Stalin was telling them. Large numbers of Italians believed Mussolini's lies. During the last decades of the 20th century, I spent a lot of time in Germany. I had a lot of German friends, some of whom were older than me and lived through the World War II years and before. I never came across a single German who admitted that they went along with Hitler. Every last one of them said they had been opposed to Hitler. I didn't believe them. I can tell you they were, and in some cases still around, they're still around, are good people. Friends of mine. In this country, large numbers of people, when I was a young man, believed Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. People tend to believe the words of people they happen to agree with. But I want to add something. Not our senator, Maine's own senator, Margaret Chase Smith. It is important to be reminded of what she said in her famous 1950 Declaration of Conscience speech on the Senate floor. And I want to emphasize she had only been in the Senate a year when she made this speech. It was a time, certainly, when freshman senators were to be seen and not heard. Whether you agree with Margaret Chase Smith or you don't agree with her, she had courage, something that seems to be lacking in the United States Senate today. Keep in mind that the first part of Margaret Chase Smith's speech is a political attack on Harry Truman and the Democrats. She was, after all, a loyal Republican. And then came her history-making words about the four horsemen of Calumet. Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it, Calumet, as the making of false and defamatory statements to damage the reputation of others. And Margaret Chase Smith, on that day in June 1950, said, "The nation sorely needs a Republican victory. But I don't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of Calumet: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear." Honestly, and I mean this, honestly, ask yourselves, not today, but over the next few days, whether you think it's possible that Margaret Chase Smith's four horsemen of Calumet are riding again. Without changing your political views or political preferences, you can ask yourself, are the political tools of the four horsemen of Calumet, fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear, tools employed by President Trump? If so, you don't need to abandon your support of Trump. Just oppose the four horsemen of Calumet. Perhaps you believe what Donald Trump says, especially when he says only he, and not the people, can save America. Not Congress, the representatives of the people, not the judicial system, only Donald J. Trump can save America. And maybe you believe him when he says, as he said to Governor Mills, "I am the law." I am not an expert on the Constitution, but our guest is an expert on the Constitution. Before we begin with our interview, I wanted to just renew your understanding of what the legislature says, what the Constitution says about powers. Article 1, Section 1 says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested not in the president, but in a Congress of the United States, the people, not a king. These were guys, the drafters, who did not like kings. when President Trump recently told Governor Mills, "I am the law," he was clearly stating he didn't give a damn about Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. Think what you will, but it's an un-American statement. President Trump and his followers may not like this constitutional assignment of power. They clearly don't. But the only way to change it is by amending the Constitution. And what about the powers that Congress was specifically allocated? The powers reserved to Congress, just to Congress. Regulate commerce with foreign nationals and impose duties, meaning tariffs. Indeed, Congress has delegated some of its power to impose tariffs on the president. There's no question that they have done so. Second, reserved only to Congress, establish rules for dealing with immigration. Rules established by Congress. They have the power to do it. They ought to do it. Coin money, raise and financially support our Army and Navy. And finally, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and carrying into execution all powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. That's Congress's exclusive job. They are the only ones with the power to do that. And then there are the powers of the president. And they are few, but presidents have, since the beginning, tried to make what they could, make the best of their limits of power. And those powers allocated specifically to the president are, when the Congress raises and equips an army and a navy, the president is the commander-in-chief. He also has the power to demand reports from his department heads. He can give opinions to his department heads. Third, he has the specific power, and the only power, to grant pardons to convicted criminals. And fourth, and this is not specifically allocated to him by Congress, but he is also free. He is not prohibited from suggesting or proposing that Congress enact a law or an amendment to an existing law. And that has been the primary way in which presidents have influenced the policies of the United States of America. They propose legislation, they lobby for legislation, they urge legislation, but they can't legislate. Finally, I want to say to all my friends watching, go online and read the oath that the president takes. We should all be aware of it. I must say that from time to time I don't think about it. But all of us should do that. And I urge you all to do it in the next few hours or days. The oath given to a president and prescribed by the Constitution, the one prescribed by the Constitution, is very, very simple. It asks only two things of the president, just two things, simple. Faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and secondly, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Professor Rudalevige, welcome. How's the president doing based on his sworn oath?
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's important to remember the Constitution, as you noted, has a pretty long Article 1 and a pretty short Article 2. Right? A lot of Article 2 is taken up trying to explain the Electoral College, And then the powers of the presidency are pretty brief. I mean, we could add a couple others, the appointment power, the veto power, treaty negotiations, but all of those are shared with Congress in some way, right? There's an asterisk on a lot of these powers. And so when you come to the oath of office, you're talking really less about powers and more about duties. And the duties of the president are pretty substantial, as you say, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but also to faithfully execute the law, to provide information to Congress. That's the State of the Union address these days. And so, the framers clearly envisioned a situation where Congress would be, the dominant policy driver of the United States. The very name president, right? He's a presider. That's been redefined in a lot of ways into the decider, as President Bush called himself. And there's something to it, right? The presidency has become more powerful over time, but nonetheless, it's an office that's constrained in the constitutional document. And, if Congress is serious about its own powers, it really has a lot that it can do. As you alluded to earlier, I don't think we've seen a lot of action by Congress, as President Trump has been quite aggressive in pushing his vision of executive authority. Obviously, that's something we can talk about, and we'll see where we go from here. But no, we've seen, I think, a first couple of months of an extremely, energetic executive. That's certainly something the framers wouldn't have objected to, but also a lack of ambition, counteracting ambition from the legislative side. That would have had them quite concerned.
The counteraction on the legislative side, some people think is non-existent. The only legislation, I may be wrong about this, and you can correct me, so far in the president's term has related to the budget, because you can't appropriate any money without Congress. So it's been budget related, but other than that, in terms of policy, in terms of, there's been no, there's problems with immigration. We all know the immigration system is broken. There's not been a proposal, a legislative proposal by the president or a member of Congress to deal with the problem of immigration. So, you know of any policy issues that have been addressed by Congress?
Congress has been pretty quiet, you're right. I mean, normally the State of the Union address, or the equivalent, right? The president not long ago gave an address to a joint session of Congress. Often that's sort of a long laundry list of stuff that he wants Congress to do. That really wasn't the case this last time, because I think actually the president would be pretty happy for Congress to do nothing. He's acting in ways that are, grounded in his vision of his own executive power. He's using not so much new laws, but old laws, trying to find new meaning in some of those laws in ways that would enable him to act a lot more aggressively in areas like immigration, education we're seeing, but also budgeting. And so I want to circle back to that quickly, right? While it's absolutely true that the power of the purse is vested entirely in Congress, right? One of the arguments we've already seen, and one of the big sort of flashpoints of action by President Trump and of course by Elon Musk, who he sort of brought on board to help with this, is budget cutting, the cutting even of existing government agencies that are created in law, that are funded in law, but which the executive branch is unilaterally trying to dismantle. And so, I don't know how long a lecture on the impoundment power you want. But
I think we'd like you to, but I think we'd like to know, they would like to know too. Impoundment, just you mentioned it, impoundment means that under certain circumstances, Congress appropriates money for a specific purpose to satisfy a policy objective, and the president pushes back and says, I'm not going to spend it.
Right. So there was a joke in the Nixon administration. Congress may pass the buck, but the president doesn't have to spend it. It was a Nixon joke, so it wasn't that funny, really. But you get the point. That was one of the times in American history where there's been sort of a flashpoint over this issue. Congress appropriates money in law, right? Appropriations bills become law. They're mandatory, not optional. And the president says, well, no, I don't have to spend this money. That's been sort of resurrected by the current administration as what it claims as a constitutional right. Now, back in the 70s, in the Nixon years, you may remember, President Nixon pushed this point. He impounded huge amounts of money that had been appropriated by Congress as a sort of line item veto, right? Stuff he didn't like, he didn't want to spend. Congress pushed back. They passed something called the Impoundment Control Act. There were a couple of court cases that went uniformly against the president. Even the Department of Justice could not come up with a good rationale for why this was legal on behalf of the president. And so it was kind of a settled issue. This battle over spending, the battle of the budget, was won by Congress. Fast forward 50 years, and those same arguments are coming back to the fore that, the president to manage spending, to cut the budget, to cut back on congressionally sanctioned waste, has to have the power to cut spending. And the short answer to that is he doesn't have that power, I think. But we're going to come, I believe, pretty quickly to a confrontation in the courts, revisiting, again, that litigation of the 1970s. I don't think that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the power of the purse moving to the presidency, but that's the argument we're going to have.
You talked about the State of the Union usually is a laundry list of proposals and things that the president, as the chief executive, wants the legislators to accomplish. And that didn't happen this year. I mean, it was a list of grievances, but not policy initiatives. I worked for President Johnson, who always had the longest laundry list. If Johnson wanted to change the country, and he did, but he knew it took legislation. So his State of the Union addresses were loaded with proposals. And not only that, the interesting thing he did, and I want people to understand this, is most of those laws that Congress passed in the 5 years that Johnson was president were as the result of studies conducted by panels that he created that studied these things, a lot of professors, and they would draft the bills and they would send them up to Congress and then try to get Congress to pass the bills. So he initiated the legislation but had no power to enact it. But that's how he exercised his power.
Well, and of course he was notably remembered for being, for the Johnson treatment, right? For the ability to kind of persuade, even bully sometimes, members of Congress into adopting his platform. But you're right, he understood as a creature of the Senate himself, right, that the power of legislation to really make important change. And my first book, about a century ago now, it feels like, was on the president's legislative program. And if you sort of count up the number of proposals over time, the 1960s, not too surprisingly, are a big, jump in the number of legislative proposals from President Kennedy and then, of course, Johnson. But it doesn't drop off that much with President Nixon, right?
No.
This is an era where legislative results are kind of prized, and you really do have, I think, a move. Now, what happens after that, right, is the consolidation of a larger government. You've got a regulatory state, effectively, where once all that legislation is in place, you then need to implement it, and that is going to happen largely through regulation, and that builds up to the point where, by the time you get to President Reagan, right, there's some resentment, and his platform is really, let's cut back on this overgrowth. But generally, presidents over time, one of the reasons that they have sort of gained power vis-a-vis Congress is that the government's bigger. It does more. We expect it to do more. Almost everything it does is for a reason. We want it to do things. There's a demand side here, right? But obviously, that then allows the president more scope for action in the administrative sense without having to go back to Congress. If you've already got an agency doing X, then you've got some leverage to try to change the way it does X. Once all kinds of money is going to the states, you can have an argument with the governor of Maine about whether you can hold up that money. And so I think, the very centrality of the federal government tends to empower the executive more than it does Congress in a certain way.
In a certain way. But we still have to observe the constitutional requirements.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we talked about the fact that Johnson, Nixon, others, every president has had to worry about getting their program passed by Congress. Mm-hmm. So they had to really worry about Congress. So a great illustrative story came to me the other day. I was talking to an old friend of mine mm-hmm. who was Johnson's last chief of staff. His name is Johnson, Tom Johnson. Tom Johnson's a well-known guy. He was the president of CNN Network. He was, before that, the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. But he was a very young man. He worked with me. He started out under me and then rose much faster. But I was talking to Tom on the phone the other day, and I was saying that, President Trump insults all the Democrats, insults them all, and he's furious with them, and he calls them names and radical communists and vermin and everything else. And he's the only president who's ever done that, because the rest of them needed Congress. He even needed their enemies once in a while. And he told me this story. He said that during the Vietnam War, several senators were the ones, Democratic senators, were giving him a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. And they were holding hearings on Vietnam, which Johnson didn't want. And he couldn't control them. He was upset. And he said he used to, Tom Johnson said he sat alone with President Johnson many times where Johnson railed against Senator William Fulbright and Senator Frank Church and Senator Wayne Morse, just railed against him. And one time, Tom Johnson said, well, Mr. President, there are things you can do that make life difficult for them, and maybe you ought to do that. And Johnson looked at him, kind of stood back and shocked, and he said, oh no, Tom, we can't do that, because sometimes they're going to vote with us. We need them. Mm-hmm. We hope to get them on our side from time to time. So we don't have any of that anymore, because there seems to be no worry about maintaining a majority to legislate, to make things happen mm-hmm. in the legislative context. You need friends. Yeah. Even across the aisle, you need friends. So
absolutely. And
you don't get them by calling them names.
Well, in fact, if your viewers might want to have some fun and go listen to some of the tapes from the Johnson Library, for example, if you go to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, they have a number of tapes of President Johnson talking to different members of Congress. And, he talks to Republicans a lot. Charlie Halleck, who is the minority leader, for example, in the House, he's trying to get him to help pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right? He's talking to, the Senate minority leader as well, a senator from Illinois.
Dirksen.
Everett Dirksen, exactly. The Wizard of Ooze, they called Dirksen.
Wizard of Ooze. I remember him because I started out in the congressional relations business. But
yeah, absolutely.
He needed them.
He needed them, and he understood that. He wanted to get stuff passed, and if that, the parties were different then, of course. You had
Southern Democrats that wouldn't go with him on civil rights.
Exactly. So he needed to build a bipartisan coalition in a way that, to be fair, is a lot harder now. It's very much harder to build a cross-party coalition because the parties, are much more internally homogenous now. They're a lot more alike inside the party and a lot further away from the other party than they were at the time. There were overlapping ideologies in the 60s, even up to the 90s, that are a lot harder to find now. That said, I think it's probably true that for President Trump especially, he's pretty happy so long as Congress can't react against him, right? He's not looking for necessarily a positive agenda so much as an inability of Congress to sort of stop what he wants to do. If he's moving unilateral, well, it's not even about intimidation so much as being able, you have pretty narrow Republican margins, right? It's a unified government, but barely so. And so, if you're President Trump, you just want Congress honestly, not to be able to overturn what you're up to. And to the degree that, for example, he's declaring an emergency, in the first term, if you remember, when he declared an emergency on the southern border, there's actually a bipartisan reaction against that, and they passed resolution.
Were Republicans against that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that was, so in fact, Congress passed a resolution, both chambers passed a resolution trying to cancel that emergency. President Trump vetoed that resolution, as you might expect, and they couldn't muster the 2/3 you would need to overturn that. And so, again, as long as he's able to veto things he doesn't like, and it can be pretty confident it's not going to get overturned, he's got kind of a lot of running room, honestly. Now, where that may run out is with regards to the budget, because as you say, you've got to pass a budget. He's looking for, a reconciliation bill that's going to extend the tax cuts that were passed in 2017. He wants more resources for his immigration agenda. There's a lot going on where he actually does need more resources rather than fewer. So I think, it's going to come over to the other side of Capitol Hill, and then, as you say, the lack of a alliance building may be problematic.
I want to talk some about the executive orders, and I want to start with the executive order on the Department of Education. I have some legitimacy here because I ran for Congress in 1980, and the year before I was campaigning, and I was asked by the Maine Education Association, Teachers Union, where I stood on creating a new Department of Education, because until then, what we had was an Office of Education at the federal level. And I didn't think we needed a Department of Education. I thought things worked out fine without it. And so I was opposed to it. Incidentally, my Republican opponent, who was the incumbent congressman, he was for what the teachers union wanted, which was the creation of the Department of Education. So I've never been for the Department of Education. So I don't mind if they dismantle it. Now every teacher, I hope not many teachers are watching, because I'll hear from them. But, so he signs an executive order. Now, I remember the work that Jimmy Carter put in getting Congress to create a Department of Education. How can he disassemble it, end it, created by Congress, with an executive order?
Well, so the short answer is he can't. As you say, the Department of Education, whether you think it was necessary to split it out from what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, whether that was necessary in the late 70s or not, it's been in place now for 40 plus years. It was passed in statute. The programs that it runs are granted to it in statute. And so it's always been a pretty small agency.
And the Department of Education is mandated by Congress. There's certain things in the law that they're supposed to do.
Right.
Congress has said, we mandate that you do such and such.
Right.
Okay.
And so then the question is, can you shift out some of its functions that aren't mandated specifically to the Department of Education? Yeah, maybe. But it's a small agency. There's only about 4,000 employees in the Department of Education. It's the smallest of the cabinet departments. And so, even if you fired every member, every staffer at the Department of Education, you're saving, very little money. What the Department of Education is a pass-through for federal money. Student loans, but especially money to the states and local governments, that rely on Title I funding. Of course, special education is a huge part of what the Department of Education oversees. And so it's really about, the money that flows through the federal government to the states and then to local school districts, and then the strings that are attached to that. And of course, if you're a firm believer in cutting those strings, that's an argument that can be had, but you can't do it simply by declaring by fiat that the law no longer applies. An executive order, to put it simply, is an order by the president to somebody in the executive branch. Right? It's not an order to anybody who's not in that category. It has to be the implementation of a power that's already granted to the president either by the Constitution or in statute. So, it's kind of fun to order things, but that doesn't have the authority to change existing law, kind of referring back to the statement by Governor Mills that you began with. It could be an interpretation of federal law, and that interpretation might be correct, even if it's new, but often that's going to have to be tested in the courts. So, an executive order is not in itself a law. It has to implement law. And so to the degree that, and if you look at the very bottom of almost all these executive orders, it says, to the extent permitted by law. And so some of these executive orders ultimately are a little bit performative. They are saying, I want to do X, I want to show that I'm taking leadership on X, I am a strong leader. But they don't necessarily get implemented. They don't necessarily have a direct effect. And you can look at a number of these things. There was an order back on the first day of the Trump term where he said, I am creating a task force to cut the cost of living. And about 2 days later, he issued a press release saying, I have delivered on my promise to cut the cost of living because I've just created this task force.
Yeah.
But, you can look at your grocery bill, the cost of living hasn't come down. Again, the action, the coverage is often in the announcement. The signing and the big holding up of the signature with the Sharpie, all of that is, makes for great TV. And so then the question is, where does the rubber meet the road? What actually happens? And that's often, not going to be by executive order, but it can tee up others in the executive branch, whether it's, Elon Musk and the so-called Doge team or others, then to take action. And so there can be indirect effects. But where you're actually using an executive order to try to overturn a pretty clearly written statute that honestly should not work.
So they often, I hear the president's people saying, well, Joe Biden used executive orders all the time. Mm-hmm. Was he a champion of executive orders? Did he set a record with executive orders, or will Donald Trump set the record?
Well, every president likes executive orders, mm-hmm. right? In fact, there's a great story in 2015 or 16 when Mr. Trump was running for president for the first time. He criticized Barack Obama because he said Obama was using too many executive orders. He said Obama was, he's too lazy to actually bargain with Congress and get things done. He fails in his efforts to persuade, and therefore he just issues executive orders, like they're butter. Well, it turns out everybody likes butter. Because
he said, like their butter?
Like their butter. He just likes...
That's a quote.
That's a quote from President Trump.
Okay.
Pre-President Trump.
Yeah.
This isn't that.
Right.
At the time, Mr. Trump. But of course, when Mr. Trump becomes President Trump, he likes butter a lot. He's issuing executive orders all over the place. Yeah. And again, the reason is that, it's hard to get stuff done through Congress. The president has a lot of authority because of the size of the executive branch, and he's got these tools. So you have sort of means, motive, opportunity, right? Any good lawyer can see where this is going. You have the ability to act here and the incentive to act because, again, it looks like you're taking action and you are able to use, the hundreds, thousands of laws that Congress has passed over time as a means of pushing forward your own agenda, even if you can't get them to pass something new. And better yet, if you do get them to pass something new, you can then use that authority to try to shape it in the way that you want to. And of course, that could be pretty different than how your predecessor wanted to shape it. So, we think of, DACA, right? The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, supposed to protect, young kids who were brought into the country by their parents. President Obama, he didn't issue, this actually was not an executive order, but certainly an administrative action. And President Obama's Department of Justice said this was legal. President Trump comes in and he gets his Department of Justice say, no, actually you don't have the power to do that. Biden comes in, his Justice Department once again says, yes, you can do it. So, there is this sort of ping pong effect going back and forth. Different lawyers will come to different conclusions about what powers you have. But I think it's fair to say that all presidents do try to use unilateral action to move their agenda forward, right? President Biden was criticized, for example, for trying to forgive student loans. And he had turned to, a statute that was passed in 2003 that said, in times of emergency, the Department of Education has a lot of discretion to, modify or even forgive the terms of existing loans.
Yeah.
And he said, look, we're still in the pandemic. This is an emergency. I'm going to go with it. Now, the Supreme Court in that case said, you don't have the authority. That's not what the statute was meant for. I think actually correctly said that he was sort of bootstrapping, more authority into that law than it was meant to have. Now, what's a little bit ironic, though, is that, Republicans at the time cheered on the courts and said, absolutely, the courts should be stepping in to prevent you from overstepping your authority. But if you look at the last week, it's been nonstop attacks on the courts for daring to even think that they had the right to review presidential actions. And that, I think, is problematic, undermining the ability of the courts to say, well, this is what the law says, this is what you did. I'm afraid there's a difference between those things.
Partisan politics, people who are fervent partisans for one side or the other, are never bothered by inconsistency. That is not an issue with them.
Fair enough. That's not a new thing either, by the way.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about something you said earlier, which is the president can issue a directive, an executive order to a department, an executive department, saying, here's the way I want you to do things. So last week, President issued an order to the Justice Department, executive order, saying that I don't want you, I guess forbid is a applicable word. I forbid you, the Justice Department, for dealing with any law firm who represented somebody opposed to me. So that puts the law firm out of business, because if they can't represent clients in federal issues, which always involves the Justice Department, they're out of business. That's a pretty tough one. That's a good one. He's got them. He can actually bring about the collapse of a law firm by depriving them of clients. As the clients have already left a couple of those law firms, they say, look, we hired you because we have an issue with the federal government and we need you to solve the issue. How can we do that if, in fact, the federal government is punishing us for hiring you as our lawyer? That's a bad start for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, it has a little whiff of the old enemies list of the 1970s.
Definitely. Not a whiff. It is the enemies list. Anybody who opposes me is going to get this treatment. And I know New York law firms who say, hey, look, we can't do this. We're going to lose our business. And unfortunately for them, they're not as idealistic as I would like them to be. They're more interested in business. That, I don't know, could that get struck down?
It's a good question. I mean, I think really it's been you've seen a series of these orders that have been surprisingly personal, right? That's kind of a new feature here. You don't normally see executive orders, which after all are designed to apply to government policy, saying, hey, I hate this law firm. Hey, take away this guy's security clearances. Hey, I hate that university. Let's go after them. And so, this latest, I think it's a memorandum maybe to the Justice Department, saying you should look at all the people who are suing the federal government and you should try to get them disbarred, actually, is what it says in the meat of that order. The Justice Department, well, it has better things to do than that.
But they're going to do it because the people that run the Justice Department are selected. Now I'm going to say something that kind of gets me worked up. The people running the Justice Department are running it, appointed there, put there by him, only because they have pledged their total loyalty to Donald Trump, not to the Constitution, to Trump. So they're going to do it. They're going to punish these law firms.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, if folks want to look at the speech that President Trump gave at the Justice Department a week or 10 days ago, He was introduced by Attorney General Pam Bondi, who is the new Attorney General, and she did sort of pledge allegiance to the president in a pretty direct way as she was introducing him. So that in itself is sort of a new development, or I guess the return of an old development. The Department of Justice, up until the 1960s, 70s, right, was sort of seen actually as a political wing of the president to some degree. Right?
Watergate put an end to that.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you had, Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, is the attorney general, right? Campaign managers are the president's, are the attorneys general.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, of politicization of the Justice Department. But as you say, you come to Watergate and you have, right, these efforts by the president to manipulate, criminal investigations and, again, this creation of enemies lists. I'm going to go after, through the IRS or through the Justice Department, people that I don't like. That backfired in the end. And this sort of idea that you should have a Justice Department and certainly an FBI that's at arm's length from the president, that norm really arises out of the ashes of Watergate. Ed Levy, who's the Attorney General under Gerald Ford, he's a law school dean, very much by the book. He's going to try to restore the independence of the Justice Department so that it doesn't respond, to the whims of the president. When the president says investigate X, they are supposed to ask, well, what's the evidence for investigating X? If there's probable cause, sure. If there's not, we let it go. And that's been for the last 50 years the norm. And, even in the first term, to some degree that held strong. If you think about at the very end of the term, there's a lot of pressure on the Justice Department to join in efforts to call the 2020 election corrupt or fraudulent. As Bill Barr, who was a Trump loyalist, said himself, that was BS. There wasn't evidence to support that. And so, you come now to Trump 2.0, and I think the Justice Department was very much a target for appointees who would be loyal. You've seen a lot of people pushed out. You've seen actually a lot of appointed officials, political appointees, who have had to sign off on some of the court motions that the administration has put forward because the careerists are, not willing to put their name on some of the arguments that are being made in court right now to defend some of the president's actions. So that is intriguing. I do think, you have, there's a lot of lawyers in this country. I actually don't think that pursuing, disbarral motions or any kind of investigations against a firm simply because they have represented someone bringing a lawsuit against the government is going to go very far.
You mean, you don't think it's going to be effective?
I don't think it will be effective, and I also think there'll be a backlash against it at the, at the bar association level or the disciplinary level.
Yeah, well.
I'd like to believe that anyway.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you because
you've been in the legal profession a lot longer than me.
55 years. I've been a member of the bar for 60 years. Yeah. And I paid a lot of attention to this in the last few days. Big law firms worry about their business. Mm-hmm. And many of these big law firms on Wall Street and in Washington, their business is focused on resolving issues, legal problems with the government. Mm-hmm. And when the president tells the Justice Department, don't deal with these or don't have anything to do with any of their clients, it's bad for business. And these people, it's kind of a cutthroat business. Mm-hmm. When one law firm, more than one law firm since last week, has gone around to certain big corporate clients and say, look, these people are on the president's S list, and they're going to have a hard time solving your problem. Come to us. We're friendly with the president. We'll get the job done. So I think it's existential with some of these law firms. I think it works. I think fear, one of the four horsemen, actually is very effective political tool. Very effective. So I think it will work. And the question is, we're going to have a court case now. We have one federal judge who's already issued a temporary restraining order in the Perkins Coie case, and we'll see what happens when it's decided on the merits. But the president can instruct his people in his cabinet what to do, and they're going to do it.
He can. On the other hand, I mean, that particular executive order, I think a lot of people were suggesting was the equivalent of a bill of attainder, right? A specific piece of legislation that attacks a single person or entity, which is specifically unconstitutional.
Good point. I didn't think about that.
So the president can't overturn a constitutional ban. If you think back to the travel ban in the first term, the president had, declared that certain nationalities were not going to be allowed to enter the country.
Right.
And there's a lot of leeway in immigration law, right? Congress has given the president a lot of power and discretion in these areas. And the only reason that was a close court case, right, was that the president had said so many, nasty things about Muslims and Islam, calling for a Muslim ban, as he termed it. That's not my phrase. That by the time it got to the Supreme Court, the dissenting opinion in that case is, well, is he issuing this because of national security, which is his claim at the time, or because of an unconstitutional animus against a certain religious group? And listed, page after page of statements that the president and candidate had made in that regard. So you're not allowed, even if you have authority in the law, to overturn a ban that's in the Constitution. In that particular case, in the travel ban case, the president won a close call, but I think in some of the orders that are targeting individual firms, I'm not so sure he's going to prevail.
So what happens if he doesn't prevail and they call him up and say the Supreme Court of the United States or the United States Court of Appeals says you can't do this? We know a lot about Donald Trump. Doesn't make a secret of anything. He doesn't hide too much. We've heard about him for a long time, long before he was president. He's been well known. The likelihood of him saying, I don't care what those judges in the Supreme Court say, we're going to do it. Then what happens? That's what's called a constitutional crisis?
Well, it's certainly an attack on the Constitution. We talk a lot about constitutional crisis, and that makes it sound like it's sort of, it's either on or off. It's a switch. We're in crisis or we're not. I think there's lots of stages of crisis. You can have certain things that are problematic even as other things are proceeding as normal. And certainly the very vocal attacks on the judiciary, and as you suggest, maybe the frank refusal to enforce judicial orders, maybe that's coming down the pike. I mean, the closest we've come to it is, of course, the case that's before the D.C. District Court right now with regards to the president's claim that he can use the Alien Enemies Act, right, a 1798 statute, to deport certain people without going through due process concerns.
Judge Boasberg, whose daughter was the captain of the Bowdoin basketball team.
Terrific athlete,
Did you have her in class?
I knew her, yes.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was a great athlete, good student.
Wow.
More importantly at Bowdoin, great student, but yes.
So, that's coming down the pike, and you're right. It's very clear to everybody, no matter what their politics, is the president is now going after the courts and trying to diminish the importance of the courts, the power of the courts, whatever, trying to say things about them that will make people distrust the courts. That seems to be the focus of what he's doing now. There's a reason for that, right?
Well, honestly, one reason that he's losing a lot of cases right now. A lot of what he's trying to do with regards to, his efforts to control the executive branch, fire certain people, some people who are protected in statute against being fired, except for cause, right? Attempts to sort of move into the world of the independent agencies, the regulatory commissions, sort of some of the firings of civil servants, The president does have a lot of authority over the shape of the executive branch, but there are ways and procedures that you have to follow. Even in that context, you have due process. And so, they've been a little bit impatient and they want action now, they want it fast, they want Elon Musk's chainsaw, right, to rip through the fabric of the government. Again, there are ways you could make those changes legally. They haven't chosen to follow that path as yet in a lot of cases, and so they are losing in court.
They could propose legislation, right? They could send legislation.
propose legislation.
Say,
They could
eliminate
change-
this department.
Oh, absolutely. And they'll have to do that with the Department of Education, ultimately, if that's what they choose to do.
Yeah.
But they also could change regulations. That itself requires a certain process.
Yes. And you've got to
under the
submit it to
Administrative
Congress,
Procedure
the
Act.
proposed change. First of all, you have to publish it.
Yep.
And you have to have time for people to comment on it. And then, in some cases,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the area, like environmental area, you got to send your proposed rule up to Congress, for them to review it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're right, it's tough. Would you say that the courts are standing between us and potential chaos?
Well,
I don't want to
again,
overstate it, but
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely appropriate for the courts to be getting these cases and to be looking at the law and on a case-by-case basis deciding whether in fact, the president has overreached his authority or whether he's delegated authority to those who don't have it, right? Again, the Doge case has lots of interesting minutia attached where, again, sort of shortcuts have been taken that, could, again, a lot of these changes could be made, but it would take longer than they seem to want to take. That said, the courts aren't really a very good avenue for broader policy deliberation. That's not their job, right? They handle the individual case that comes to them. And so if you want to have a debate over deportation or immigration policy or education policy or spending, if you want to cut Social Security offices, right, or change the policies there, well then, yeah, you go to Congress and you try to move that through the legislative process.
we're going to end it there because we've run out of time, but I would say to everybody here, the courts are there to ensure due process and ensure that the rule of law prevails, and it ain't easy. Thank you, Professor, for coming here tonight. We really appreciate it. It's been very helpful. I think it's been very helpful to the audience.